I will now introduce Dr. Hespanha. He comes from the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He is the recipient of a National Science Foundation Career Award and also several other Best Paper Awards and prizes. His research interests include hybrid and switch systems, the modeling and control of communication networks, the use of vision and feedback control, and also stochastic modeling in biology. So if you'll all help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Hespanha.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me here. Thanks for all coming here after lunch. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about stochastic network systems. And I have a slide here to tell you about the topics I'm going to be covering here. So I'm going to talk about the modeling framework, which I'm going to be called stochastic hybrid systems, and many people call it exactly the same. And I'm going to try to not show a very formal description of this model. This model can get very technical. But instead of a very formal description, I'm going to talk about examples and showing examples. I think in examples it will make it very easy for you to understand. Let's see if I get this one. Yeah. To understand what stochastic hybrid systems are. In the beginning of the talk, I'm going to choose models, particular examples, which are very relevant and probably familiar to people that work in cyber-physical systems, so things from network control systems. That's how I got interested in stochastic hybrid systems. And those examples, I'm going to choose very simple examples because I can imagine. I think that if you know a little bit about cyber-physical systems, even if I show you a very simple example, then you can imagine all sorts of ways of complicating that. And some of the complications will lead to things that we can analyze, other ones that we can't analyze. I'll try to point out what things we could generalize that we still know how to analyze and which ones we can't. The ones we can't are more interesting for researchers. And then I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about using the same formal model to analyze problems in biology. And there, because I suspect that you don't know as much as about biology as in cyber-physical systems, I certainly didn't know up to a few years ago. There, I'm going to sort of spend more time with the modeling and there try to give you more of an overview of the things people with our background could do within that context, right? It's somewhat interesting and nice that Ellen Gill is here, or she was here until a moment ago, because in fact my interest on network control systems and stochastic hybrid systems started a program that she was managing. Okay, but I'm not just going to tell you about the modeling framework, because constructing models is great, but models are only useful, at least for me, if you can actually analyze them in some formal way. Because analysis leads to understanding and leads to design, okay? And so as I am going to tell you about this modeling framework, interesting examples, I'm also going to tell you about some tools that are available. And I'll not give you proofs of these tools. What I'm going to do instead is showing you how you can use them. Okay, so stochastic hybrid systems, the first thing to talk about is deterministic hybrid systems. I'm not going to assume that you know exactly what deterministic hybrid systems are, but we've seen already here some examples of hybrid systems. So this diagram that you see is a way to represent them. It's what's called an hybrid automata representation. And the way to think about this, you have this thing called modes. When you're in this mode, you have this differential equation. If you go to that mode, you have a different differential equations. And the arrows represent transitions between modes. Everything is deterministic here. You go from one mode to the other if certain conditions become true. Right? If here this G1 becomes larger or equal than 0, then you see that's a transition to that mode. The differential equation changes. But also, we allow to have this reset map. So there's going to be some instantaneous discontinuity in X. And we've seen this before, some of these items in the talk that there was this morning. So I need to introduce stochasticity, and I'm going to introduce them in several different ways. In fact, although it may not be obvious in the beginning, I'm going to sort of build up and introduce more and more, put more and more stochastic elements into this model. So the first thing I want to do Oh, this slide to remind me that now and then, so this particular deterministic hybrid system has several modes. Some of the questions that we're going to study here, they are still interesting if you have a single mode. So it could have a system that as simple as is always the same differential equation, a condition that leads to a reset of the state. And so because these systems are simple, just have to talk about an f and a g and a phi, sometimes I'm going to talk about results for that version with the understanding that they generalize to other versions, okay? Okay. The simplest form of introducing stochasticity in a system like that is by replacing your deterministic equations that govern when you have a transition by something stochastic, right? So the change I made in this picture was that I introduced these t's here, t1, t7, t1, t2, t3, t4, t5, t6 in this particular way. And the understanding is that these t's now are random variables. Of course, t1 is always smaller than t2, smaller than tt, etc. And in the simplest form of this, the difference between consecutive t's are independent and identically distributed. Okay. There's some special cases which have a long history. One of them is when the differences are exponentially distributed random variables. It's something that's known as Markov jump systems. What makes this especially nice from a theoretical perspective is that this x, which now becomes a stochastic process, is a Markov process directly. Okay, and so there's lots of things you can talk about x just by using theory of Markov processes. But that turns out to only be true when the tk plus 1 minus tk's are exponentially distributed. If they are not, the x itself is not a Markov process. There's ways of turning it into a Markov process, but it's not. So this is sort of the abstract model. Let me go to now start with examples. And this is the sort of canonical example of a control system where we have communication between two of the elements in the control system, in this case, a sensors and a controller, through a network, communication network. So in this case, I'm just trying to make things a little bit more interesting. I see that there's two sensors, and so data from two sensors have to be sent through this network, and I put this switch here to imply that I would not be allowed to send the data from both sensors at the same time. Right? So sometimes you send sensor 1, sometimes you send sensor 2. And what you do here, I can't imagine anything simpler than that. When you get a sample, you hold it, and what you get into the controller is the held value. And sometimes, at some sample times, this hold is updated, other sample times that hold is updated. Okay, I guess it could be simple if you had a single sensor. The problem would still be interesting. But there's two here. If I want to write down, and I'm assuming here linear process and linear controller, and I am putting here a very simple protocol to access the network, which is they use a round-robin fashion. So sensor 1 sends, sensor 2 sends, sensor 1 sends, sensor 2 sends. If I want to write down this as a dynamical system, it's not too difficult. The state of this is going to be the state of your process, the state of the controller, if the controller is a state. And these hold elements are dynamical systems too, right? They take an input and they hold it for a while. So you need that as part of your state. This mechanism of getting data through the network could be modeled by something like this. So let's call the state of these guys y hat. The y hat at a certain instant of time tk, and I haven't yet told you what tk's are, but at a certain time when, so the tk's, I didn't tell them they generate. The tk's here, according to this picture, is the times at which you send things to the network. At the odd instance of time, you see here that y hat sub 1 becomes equal to the true measurement y1. So what I'm saying is that the odd instant of times, sensor data goes to the network, takes absolutely no time to get to the other side. And so at tk, you just get exactly what the measurement was, I guess, technically, the limit from below. Okay. But at the odd instance of times, the y hat 2 doesn't change. It's a continuous, right? The limit from the left is equal to the value at the point. And at even instance of times, things flip, and that's one way to model this sending data in a round-robin fashion. Now, up to this point, I could tell you, well, I'm going to sample this system every 1 second. And what you get here would be, you can turn this into, turn out to be a time-varying, discrete time system if you look at just sample times. But it's a periodic one, and there's something called lifting that you could use and analyze this system. But I want to make these things more interesting. I want to bring the fact that there's a network here. And so I want to think about what happens, especially the word shared is very important, because this network potentially is being shared with several other mechanisms, feedback loops or not. And so what happens if the network is not available by a particular sample time tk? So this guy is ready to send data, but the network is busy. Several things you could do. I'm going to focus here on the second option. Well, first, obviously, you have to wait. I'm assuming here there's no preemption. So you're going to have to wait. And I'm going to consider this protocol. And so the protocol here I'm going to consider is the fact that at that point, you start monitoring the usage of the network. As soon as you see an opportunity to send, you go resample the data and send it. There's another version of this that you monitor the network. As soon as you have an opportunity, you just send the data that you had sampled before. It will just force you to have a little bit more complicated state. So I'm using this one, which in fact seems like a reasonable thing to do. The key thing, though, is that once you do that, the difference between consecutive samples in the model that you saw before becomes something that's not quite predictable, because there's something external to your system that's utilizing the network. Okay? And a very reasonable thing to do this is to imagine that this becomes a stochastic process. It's a random variable. Okay? The tk is minus tk plus 1. And you can, in fact, go to specific protocols, network access protocols, and check that, in fact, this modeling the difference between sample times as identically distributed random variables is quite good. It's quite good. I should say, however, that this difference between consecutive sample times, we can get quite complicated distributions. Just think about the process, what's going up, and suppose that I decide to sample every 1 second. I will never have, in general, tk plus 1 minus tk smaller than 1, right? Because I sample 1, I wait a second, then my next sample time. And then with a certain probability, I'm going to succeed. So there's going to be some probability mass in that distribution right there at exactly 1 second. Sometimes I fail. Well, then it depends on the protocol. Many protocols then decide, well, I'm going to wait a random amount of time and try again. Okay, so then in that case, now the distribution, depending how you're deciding this weight, could be something, basic whatever form your protocol is. Very often is an exponential. So you'd have in that case, you'd have one probability mass, like a Dirac, and then essentially going to have the sum of these of exponentials, because you could try once. If that fails, you try again, another exponential. So it could be reasonably complicated distributions. I guess the main point I want to make is that there's no hope, or it's very unlikely it's going to be exponential, right? So it's not going to be a Markov process X. Nevertheless, I can very easily model this as one of the stochastic hybrid systems I showed you before. Just call X to be a stack. You stack everything that's dynamic, all the states in your system, process, controller, in this case, the state of the holds. You, without too much effort, could write an equation x dot equals to ax between sample times. It's basically open loop. Those are going to be open loop equations. And at sample times, the state of process and controller remains continuous, and you're going to have one of the holds going to be updated. And so in this case, it was a round robin. You could have 2 states. This corresponds to an update to an odd instant of time. So one of the holds is updated. Here is when it's the even instance of times. The other hold is updated. And the only thing that, so they have exactly the same dynamics because the open loop dynamics. But here you have a reset map that captures the fact that one particular hold is updated, and another reset map, it's the other one updated. Everything is linear. So that's what you get. OK, so let me sort of try to motivate the kind of results we have for stability of these type of systems. So I'm going back now to a case of a single mode. This one actually turned out to have 2 modes. They had 2 modes exactly because I had 2 sensors. But let's pretend I only had 1 sensor. In which case I would only have 1 mode, and this would be just the update as a single hold. So this is what the system looks like. This tk plus 1 minus tk IID random variables. So one thing that's very tempting to do, and it's a good idea, is to analyze the system at sample times, right? So I'm going to call x sub k the value of my state x at times tk. Okay? In that case, it's very easy. It's a linear system. I can tell exactly what's going to happen. For a while, you're going to evolve according to this equation, which is an exponential, and then you have a reset map, and that's the j. And you keep doing this. The catch, of course, is that this tk plus 1 minus tk is a random variable. Okay. That's not too difficult. So one thing you could do, inspired by analysis of linear systems, discrete time, is to try to come up with a quadratic Lyapunov-like function, right? So let's take a matrix P and compute the evolution of xk plus 1 p xk as a function of your xk. So here, this is stochastic, so I have to think about expected values, but this would be the expected value of this quadratic function at next instant of time, given the value at the current instant of time. And it's simple, you just do this. You have to plug in that formula there, once because you have an xk plus 1 here, transpose because you have the x1 plus there, with the understanding that this delta here, used to be those random variables, has a particular distribution which I'm calling capital F. Okay, and this is IID, so it's always the same capital F. So, for example, then what you conclude from this little formula is that if you could find a matrix P such that the expected value, which is basically this thing here, at xk plus 1, of course, this is just the matrix in the quadratic form, is smaller than the quadratic form with the original P's, then you should have stability. I mean, or now we have to be a little bit more precise. If this is the case, then I think it would not be too hard for you to believe that at least at the sample times, X is going to be well behaved. In fact, if this matrix is strictly smaller than that, in the sense that the difference is negative definite, then you're going to have exponential stability. There's two interesting things here to complete this. One is it enough to only be concerned about what happened at sample times? Question one. Second, is this a necessary condition? I mean, are we just being incredibly, is this just incredibly wishful thinking to imagine that just because I'm able to compute stability using a quadratic Lyapunov function, I'm going to actually have a necessary and sufficient condition? Regarding the first question of whether or not we only have to worry about sample times, the answer is not necessarily. If we had exponential distribution, that would be the case. If we had a distribution with a finite support, that would also be the case. But if you have distributions which don't have a finite support, exponential is actually an example, though I'm telling you that exponential is not a problem, then one has to worry. Because conceivably, if you have an infinite support, everything could be going well at sample times, but if the sample times are very far apart and the matrix is exploding exponentially, things could go bad, right? So in fact, the conditions that you have here, which will turn out to be necessary and sufficient, have always two components. And I actually presented in this theorem two conditions because at this point it starts to matter what kind of stability you want. So for example, if we're talking about exponential stability, meaning that this limit now, I had before an expression of something converging exponentially fast. The key difference is that now it is t in continuous time that's converging to 0. I'm not just worried about the sampling times. Then you have the condition that you had before. A sufficient condition is that some LMI like the one this is exactly the condition I showed before works. It's a linear matrix inequality in the sense that it's linear on P, so finding this P is a convex problem. But then you also need another condition, which, by the way, does not depend on the jumps at all, just to take care of what happens between the sample times. And the way to think about this is that essentially the tail of the distribution of F, is interval, the distribution between sample times, has to decrease. If the system is stable, you don't have to worry about it. If the system is unstable, the tail of distribution has to decrease faster than some sort of measure of instability of the matrix, which could be captured by this expression. There's also another expression, a little bit more messy, that you could express just in terms of the eigenvalues of A. It's basically what matters for this thing to be old or not is the eigenvalue. All the eigenvalues of A compared to the tail of that distribution. And this turned out, and that's a little bit was surprising, at least to me, that these are necessary and sufficient conditions for stability. And by the way, the exponential differs from asymptotic in general. So this is exponential asymptotic just by what happens between sample times. Now, the good news here is that if you happen to have one of these stochastic hybrid systems where all the stochasticity comes from the sample time, so something that probably should be called time-driven stochastic hybrid system, and if your system is linear, then we have a necessary and sufficient condition for the stability of these systems. Okay, and we even know Lyapunov functions. Things that we don't know very much are what happens if the system is nonlinear, right? That's a big thing. And what if the stochasticity enters in different ways, okay? So let me now precisely go back to more interesting ways by which a system could be stochastic. So this is the picture I showed you before. This is in red is the stochasticity here entering. And what I want to do next is to allow coupling between the times at which you have jumps and the system dynamics, which here was forbidden because the difference between the t case was just identically distributed random variables, which had nothing to do with dynamics. Okay, so this is how I'm now drawing my systems. The labels here now should be read in the following way. If you are in a certain mode, let's say this mode, and I give you a very small interval of time, let's say from some time t and t plus dt, and I ask myself, what's the probability that the transition is going to take place? That's that expression. Right? So it's going to be proportional to the length of the interval. The longer you wait, the more likely it is that you're going to transition. And it's going to be proportional. This proportionality constant is something that depends on x. So now transitions and the state are coupled. To be perfectly correct, this expression can only be understood in the limit as dt go to 0. Of course, you can never expect to get here some probability larger than 1. So in fact, this is sort of just a probability of having a transition in a small interval of time of length dt as dt goes to 0. The particular case of lambdas constant, so when lambdas don't depend on the state, this turns out to be exactly the kind of system we saw before with exponential distribution. Turns out that in that case, x would be just this Markov process that we saw before. Actually, by the way, in this case, x is a Markov process. I will introduce another form of stochasticity also. At this point, I'm trying to go forward a little faster. But this one, I think it's very easy for all of you to accept, and perhaps one of the first ones you're expecting, which is I'm going to allow also to have stochastic differential equations in the mode. So even if you stay in a mode, you could imagine some white noise, Brownian motion appearing there. Okay, and this brings me to, I need this for this second example here. Still a problem related to networks and network control systems. I've went from a controls problem to an estimation problem. There's many versions of this problem. This falls under the class also of the simplest one I could imagine that I can put in one slide. And you have a process here which has some noise, and you want to estimate the state of this. What makes this problem interesting is that you want to construct your estimate far away from your process. Right? So there's a network in between. And I've trivialized everything else that's not this communication to the network. So I'm allowing you to have perfect measurements of your state. Of course, in general, you wouldn't have that. I'm saying that you don't need to quantize the network. Quantization would be an interesting thing here, but I'm saying, well, this is you have enough bits that you don't have to worry about quantization. Like in the previous one, I'm saying there's no delays, okay? Because I want to focus precisely on this some particular aspect which is less common. No delays, no quantization, no measurement toys, full state access. So the problem I want to figure out is what kind of protocol should I use to transmit data through the network? By the way, because of these assumptions, the reconstruction of my state becomes almost trivial. Once I get a packet through the network, I know exactly the state of my system, right? In between packets, I have open loop estimation, and if you have a system like that, regardless of phase stable or unstable, the best thing to do is to construct your estimator in that way. There's nothing to do. So the problem is just about what protocol should I use to transmit data to the network. And one very simple protocol, so this thing I call decoder logic is trivial. I'm going to propose a protocol, and many other people consider protocols of this type, which is that is this. This encoder knows exactly what data was sent. I'm saying here, in fact, that there's no packet drops. There's versions of these with packet drops which are more interesting, but or more challenging. But if this data goes to the network and never gets lost, the encoder knows exactly what the decoder knows. Of course, the decoder doesn't know because it doesn't know the state, right? But the encoder can construct an estimate of what's on that side and can always, in principle, compare the state of your system that you just measured with the estimate that exists on the other side. And if the decoder has a good estimate, then there's no point in sending data. You're just wasting time. If you see that the error is large, then you should send data. Okay? There's many variations now how to actually implement this algorithm. I'm going to construct a stochastic one. And what I'm going to say is that you're going to modulate the probability of sending data. You're going to do this stochastic, but you're going to modulate the probability of sending data based on the error. So what you get there in this case is, so constructing here a stochastic hybrid system that models the error dynamics of the error. So I define my error to be the true state minus the estimated state. While no data flows through the network, I just have to subtract those two equations, and that's what I get here. When I send data, the way these things were set up, the error goes exactly to 0 because I got exactly the right data. That's why this reset map exists. If you have quantization, this would go to something non-zero, right? If you have a maximum quantization error, you know this goes to something that's bound by a quantization error. And then what I'm writing here is that the probability of a transition, which in this case means the probability of sending data, is going to be a function of the current error. And for this to make sense, this lambda of E probably should be some sort of monotone increasing function of the error, right? If the error is very small, if the error is 0, there's no point in sending data. If the error is small, then you should have a small probability. If the error is very large, you should send data with very high probability. So just pick that lambda as a design parameter. Okay. I clearly cannot analyze this system using the tool I've shown you before because now the times, the interval between samplings are not pre-specified. There's no distribution. Distribution will come out of this algorithm, right? So I want to use this to introduce Lyapunov-based methods to analyze these systems. Okay, and I think you all know what Lyapunov-based method is, but I have one slide about Lyapunov-based methods for ordinary differential equations. And it's worth to have this slide just to emphasize that the key technical result about using Lyapunov methods for studying stability of differential equations is this formula. It's a formula that allows you to compute the derivative of some test function along a solution as a function of a partial derivative times x dot, which now is f of x. Okay? Why is this important? Because suppose that I pick a Lyapunov function, let's say the simplest one you can imagine, x squared. I apply that formula. I get that the derivative of v is given by partial times the total with x with respect to time. If suppose that I don't know how to solve this system, right? And typically, this could be a very difficult ODE to solve. But suppose that I'm able to show that for every x, regardless of if x is a solution or not, this is smaller or equal than 0. And even without solving the system, I automatically know that this function cannot grow, right? And so I automatically can bound v of x naught by its value at 0. And I establish boundedness without solving my system. So the key result that's needed to analyze a stochastic hybrid system using Lyapunov method is a formula like this. It would be an algebraic formula that allows me to study the evolution of test functions along the solution of a system. And such formulas exist. And they are precisely algebraic formulas. They look like this. So if you have one of these systems with perhaps a continuous and a discrete state, and you have a test function v, and you want to figure out what's the evolution of v along solutions to my system, the formula says the derivative of, and now remember these are stochastic processes, so it's the derivative of an expected value, is given by the expected value of some formula here, and that formula is an algebraic formula. It may look a little bit complicated, but it's completely trivial to compute. Okay? It really has three terms. There's a term that we're used to, and perhaps we should expect, some partial derivative of v with respect to x times that thing there. There's a term which captures your jumps, and it's as simple as you add over all the jumps the difference of v pre-jump and post-jump. And then you have a term, which is a quadratic term. See, now it's interesting that this formula requires v itself, its first derivative, and its second derivative. Okay? And this would be something that you'd be familiar with if you've seen stochastic differential equations and Ito calculus. There's one thing here which it's probably worth emphasizing here, that it's perhaps a little bit unexpected. The solution of this system in general, both q and x, will be discontinuous. If you look at one particular solution, they are jumping all over the time. But this formula is actually telling you that the expected value of that is continuous. Actually, it's more than continuous, it's differentiable, right? This is saying that this derivative exists. It actually exists almost everywhere, but that's a minor thing. It's definitely continuous. And the reason why that's happening is that although every single trajectory may be discontinuous, the jumps are never all at the same time. And so when you take expected values, this thing actually becomes differentiable almost everywhere. Okay. So if I go back to my system, the one I was analyzing, it turns out that this thing which I could call sort of it's called generally the extended generator of the stochastic process X, or the stochastic hybrid system. It's this, the formula I saw before. It uses this A, uses the B there, uses the lambda here. So it's simple to compute. And it turns out that there are Lyapunov methods to study the stability of this system just in terms of this extended generator. And they look pretty much like the ones we're used to for deterministic systems. For example, if you have a function v, which is basically positive, definite, radially unbounded, which you can express in terms of these class K functions. If you're not familiar with them, it's just positive, definite, radially unbounded. If this algebraic operator turns out to be always negative definite, then you have almost sure asymptotic stability. So this is a statement you have now. When you go to stochastic process, definitions of stability are a little more tricky, but what this is saying is that the probability that your state is going to misbehave in the sense that you're going to find at some point a very large value of x becomes very small, either as the initial condition becomes very small, or this bound, the bound by which you're using to define misbehaving, becomes very large. Okay? That's an asymptotic stability result. And this is a probability about sample paths. Is a notion of probability that looks at the probability of particular paths misbehaving. There's also definitions about what happens in expected values. Does the expected value is finite or not? And there's lots of algebraic conditions. The important points, everything that's on the left-hand side there are algebraic conditions that you could test in the same way that you test for deterministic systems. So that when you satisfy these conditions, you get the appropriate notions of stability. It's also interesting that this function L that you have here, well, let me show you here. It's linear. It's an operator. You can see this is an operator linear on V. And what that allows you is to use things like, if you know what this means, backstepping. Backstepping is about getting a Lyapunov function by summing Lyapunov functions of different systems and just using the fact that you can add up the right-hand sides of the equations. Same thing happens here. So if you could conceivably use backstepping, you can actually do some versions of adaptive control that do using stochastic switching as opposed to tuning, just because you just have the same equations. All right. So with this tool, let me tell you just a quick and simple result. It turns out that in this system, if you put here any function that is an unbounded function of E, it doesn't matter what it is, you're going to get asymptotic stability, and in fact, every single moment is bounded. One interesting thing is that if you compare that with having, let's say, a lambda, for example, that does not depend on E, or even a periodic sampling, you're able to get stronger bounds. It says your state doesn't grow as much using less communication. Okay, so it's actually a pretty good algorithm. It's not quite optimal. The optimal looks slightly different. Okay, so the last part of my talk is now I'm going to switch a bit to biology, but it's motivated by the fact that in many problems you want to go beyond just stability and bounds, and you'd like to sort of have more quantitative analysis of the behavior of this system. Okay, it's certainly, if you tell a biologist that the system they're working on is stable, you're not going to be particularly impressed, because of course, if they would hear you say the system is unstable, then they would be just saying that your model is wrong. That's all there is to it. I mean, we don't, unless you go to extreme diseases like cancer, you don't have unstable systems, right? So it's all about understanding how different parameters affect the system. Okay. So let me tell you about gene expression. So this was the topic of the PhD thesis of one of my students. I'm showing you some results about that. Gene expression is about producing proteins, which are encoded in genes. And it's a very complicated process involving many, many chemical reactions. But the 4 ones that you have there are believed to be the most important ones. You have really 2 processes. You have transcription, which is basically you read the DNA and produces mRNAs. And then there's a translation process. That's the process that actually creates the protein from the mRNA, the single-stranded mRNA. And then the other 2 equations that you have here, eventually, so the way this works is that you produce one of these mRNAs, and then the mRNAs, they have these ribosomes that read the mRNAs and produce the proteins. And the mRNAs eventually die. Right? So one mRNA can produce many proteins. Depending on the lifetime of this mRNA, you produce 1 protein, 2 proteins, 10, 100 proteins. Eventually, the proteins decay or they're used by something, and that's those 4 chemical reactions. I'm going to do here one further simplification of this. It's not uncommon. Basically, it's going to allow me to write equations in a single slide and reduce this to a single variable. I'm going to replace these 3 chemical reactions by a net reaction, where I just say that now and then I'm going to have a burst production of a certain number of proteins. So I'm considering here each one of these will be a transcription event, which is the production of 1 molecule of mRNA, and that one eventually produces many proteins. But it's a random variable. Okay. If I do that, then a model that's widely accepted for this kind of systems could be represented by this stochastic hybrid system. And by my simplifications, it became also just one state. You really have then 2 events. You have transcription events, which is production of protein, and you have decay events. So when you have a production event, x goes to x plus n being how many proteins were produced in a particular transcription event, and that's going to be a random variable. I collapse all these things in such a way, but to get it correct, it will be a random variable, and then I could actually compute exactly the statistics of this random variable. I think they are in the next slide. And that is, at this point, I'm talking about what's called unregulated gene expression, meaning that you have these events appearing at a constant rate. Stochastic, these are stochastic events. So that's this k here, does not depend on x. And then you have these decay events. And the idea, of course, is that each decay event is decay of 1 protein. If I have 10 proteins, I don't have that many decay events. If I have 10,000, I'm going to have 1,000 more decay events. So decay events are proportional to the current number of proteins. That's why this the x appears here, and d is just a constant. And this is this particular stochastic hybrid system is equivalent to something that's very well known called Gillespie stochastic simulation algorithm. That you may have heard of, but anyway, it's widely accepted under certain regimes. Okay, so we would like to understand a little bit how such a system evolves and make perhaps predictions, maybe estimate parameters based on experimental data, etc. So I am going to go back to the formula I showed you before, which I think it was written in the slide, but I never told you. This formula to compute derivatives of expected value is something called Dinkin's formula. I'm showing it in the differential form, which is a little bit less common, but that's the one that looks nicer here. For this system, this LV is this thing here. It's easy to compute. And suppose that I would like to know what expected value of x should I observe here, and how much variation would I observe around this expected value. So how much noise, that we call the intrinsic noise of this system. Well, one thing I could do is to try to compute expected value of x, and if I get expected value of x squared, and I have expected value of x, I can compute variances. There's a simple formula for that, as you all know. So let's try to build a system of differential equations for the two quantities that I want, and that's possible because I can always, this v was an arbitrary function, so suddenly it could be x or it could be x squared. And this is what I get for this particular system. And a few things that are interesting, if you look at the right-hand side of this formula, is that you have some parameters coming in. This expected value, and if you remember, was the burst size, the number of proteins that you produce on each transcription event. And it turns out that you could analyze the system, not showing you here how, but it turns out to be a random variable which has this mean and that variance. Just accept that you could use experimental data to get those numbers, okay? So you get essentially parameters k, this expected value of n, expected value of n squared, and then you get on the right-hand side things that appear on the left-hand side, precisely the things that are in red. So the conclusion is that what you have is a differential equation. If I give you initial values for expected value of x or x squared, you solve that differential equation and you get exactly expected value of x and x squared. You could, for example, compute. I do have. So I could solve this. In fact, by the way, it's a linear system also. It's even better than just a differential equation. It's a linear differential equation. Most biologists would be interested not so much in the evolution of x as a function of some initial condition. They would be interested in steady state values. You never quite have initial conditions. That's, of course, trivial. Just set that equal to 0, and you get some formulas like this. So this is the expected value in terms of the parameters. And this would be what's called the coefficient of variation, which is a standard deviation normalized by the mean. This generally in this literature, this would be called the intrinsic noise because it's variations on x that just depend on the process by which x is produced. Now, unregulated gene expression like this one is not very common. Generally, you have regulated expression, which means that this rate at which you have transcription events is either directly or indirectly a function of the protein count itself. Okay? So, meaning that this piece here, the rate at which this occurs depends on x, which would lead to a stochastic hybrid system, which have instead of a constant rate, has here something that depends on x. And in fact, at least half of the known regulated systems in E. coli, for example, one of the best studied bacteria, turns out to be of this type. In fact, they are negative feedbacks. Negative feedbacks here, what it means is that this function g of x, that determines the production of x, is a monotone decreasing, right? So it's something that looks like this. When you have little x, you're very likely to produce more x. If the x begins to increase, you're starting to get less and less likely to produce x. Okay? There is, however, one piece of bad news here. When I take one of these autoregulated gene expression circuits and try to do the same trick I've done before, which is to compute this thing, what I have on the right-hand side, see this there used to be a k here. Now there's a g of x. that when it was a constant would come out of some expected values. And for example, here it has to be k times expected value of n. But now it doesn't, because you have to take the expected value of g of x. And so what means is that the expressions of expected values that you have in the right-hand side are no longer necessarily the ones that are in the left-hand side. Okay? Now, there's a few cases which are simple. For example, if g of x is a linear and affine function of x, you're still in good shape, because let's say, imagine this is ax plus b. You take the a out, the b out, and this becomes linear. Here, ax plus b would have a quadratic term, but that's fine because that's still here. So for the case g linear, the trick I've shown you before to this computation and compute steady-state value still works. But for any polynomial of order larger than 2, or in fact any function which is not affine, you have a problem. You have something that's called the moment closure problem. Let's say, suppose that x, for sake of argument, was g of x, suppose it was x squared. If g of x was x squared, then you'd have here expected value of x squared. Okay, that's no problem. It's right here. The expected value of x, that's there. But here you'd have a problem, because you'd have expected value of x cubed. And that's not on the right-hand side here. Now, I could imagine that I increase now this dynamical system to increase expected value of x cubed. And if you did that, what you get is an expected value of x4. This is what's called the moment closure problem, because the right-hand side, you're always trying to catch up, but you can never catch up. There's always a few extra terms. Now, there are a few tricks to deal with this, and I'm not even going to go through all of them. Let me just tell you that Abi, which is a student that worked on this, he worked quite hard to get this thing a derivative matching, which is it's a nice method. But actually, the simplest method works extremely well, which is just do a local linearization of g of x. Right? What you had here in this expression says if g is an affine function, you have no problem. So the simplest thing you can do is to just linearize g around some point. And you can even leave open the point. In fact, a reasonable thing to do is to linearize around the mean. Of course, this will make sense if the distribution is going to be somewhat concentrated around the mean. So imagine this picture here. If I'm linearizing around this point, if the distribution fits all in this area, then a line is a pretty good approximation. Of course, if the distribution is all the way here, well, maybe all the way here the line would not be too bad. But if I start putting it there, then it's not going to work. The method that Abi worked on, this derivative matching, actually works a little bit better in some extreme cases. But let's do here the simplest thing with linearization. So you do the same thing that you've done before. I'm going to sort of skip here the algebra. But what you get now, and I'm skipping the. So you change the process. You auto-regulate it. There's two things that change: the mean, the variance, in particular all the moments. Let me focus here on the one that is interested to many biologists, which is the coefficient of variation, this measure of variability. Because there's this idea that in many systems, feedback is being used by cells to regulate the level of proteins. Okay? And in fact, there's even experimental verification by doing mutations on cells that you measure the level of, measure the noise in a particular protein, and then you create a mutant which has that particular feedback loop broken, and you observe that the noise increases. So it turns out that that is consistent with all this analysis. If it wasn't, I probably wouldn't be telling you about it. So the formula that you have for the coefficient of variation, this noise, when you have negative feedback, you have an extra term here. This didn't used to be here. This was the unregulated formula. And now you have a term which is always smaller than 1. There's many ways of writing this. You may have noticed that I didn't write it in terms of the parameters like this d or whatever this n was. I carefully wrote it in terms of things that could be measured experimentally. And it's important to do this because if you're ever going to try to verify this, you have to present your formulas to a biologist in terms of things that can be measured. And so something that they certainly know what it is something called the protein's response time, which has to do with decay. And in fact, all this is about the term that appears here in terms of the noise is the square root of the response time with feedback divided by the response time with no feedback. So you get this by a wild type bacteria, and you get this one by doing a mutation that you break the feedback loop. Okay? And what this formula showed us was, for some circuits for which data was available, that it's a reasonably effective mechanism to reduce feedback. Reduces, for example, in this particular data from a particular paper that they had done really the perfect experiments for us, reduced by a half. Now, still have a few more minutes, so let me just tell you one next more step. This story is a long story, but I'll give you one more step into this story of gene regulation and what one can learn about it. It turns out that the intrinsic noise is not the whole story. In all these equations that were here, there are lots of species involved, lots of enzymes. And there's the question of what dominates the noise when you observe a fluctuation in the protein. Is it just the birth process of that protein, or perhaps the fact that you are using enzymes which are themselves stochastic? Okay? The effect of such enzymes will be called the extrinsic noise. In terms of our model, what happens is that you should imagine that this function that represents the rate at which you have transcriptions depend not just on the state x, but perhaps on other random variable z. And one challenge is that you may not know what z is. Okay, z is just, there's some, among the literally hundreds of enzymes involved in this, perhaps one or several introduced noise into your system and you don't know which. I mean, you certainly know that these are not all the chemical reactions. There's hundreds more chemical reactions, but that they could be hidden. So one could still, nevertheless, ask the question, well, if I would introduce here a random variable, which has some intrinsic noise of the type we've seen before, what would be the effect of that? This technique of linearization is great because you can linearize anything, right? I can just go here and linearize this with respect to x and z. That becomes linear. If you do that, you get another formula. I'm writing now the coefficients of variation squared, and it turns out that there's precisely in this decouples very elegantly into two terms. There's a term we've seen before and has been calling intrinsic noise, and there's another term, it's called extrinsic noise, which is a constant, turns out by coincidence that constant squared, times the noise in Z, which was this enzyme we may not know what it is. Right? So what you get out of this form, you get lots of things. For example, you get the fact that, remember, we're talking here, this is a constant that's something like 1/2 or something like that. You get, for example, that transcription regulation, which is a particular feedback mechanism you're seeing here, is much more efficient at reducing extrinsic noise than intrinsic noise. You see, this square here makes this term to be 1/2. Well, it's a little bit more than 1/2, and this will be about 1/5. So this particular form of regulation is much more effective at reducing noise coming from extrinsic factors. Okay? It turns out it also provided a technique to try to get insight into the cell. So we did this computation without knowing what Z is. Right? So you could imagine this experiment. You go to the cell, you measure the coefficient of variation in X. You have this formula. Everything has been experimentally validated except this term. Well, instead of using that formula to predict X, because I can measure that, I use that formula to figure out what is the coefficient of variation of this unknown species, which I could hypothesize that it's creating noise. And then I go, and among all the enzymes that exist inside the cell, I could try to figure out, well, is there one that matches? Now, possibly none, because maybe it's not the cause of one enzyme, it's the cause of 10 of them, right? And you're just seeing the additive effect. It turns out that in this particular paper, they had hypothesized that it was the variation on plasmids. Bacteria don't have just one sequence of DNA, they have genes in various plasmids. And it turns out that the value that we got here matched the coefficient of variation that they had measured in the plasmids. So that was pretty nice confirmation well, we can say confirmation, but at least self-consistency. Their hypothesis with the formulas we got. Okay, so this is basically the end of my talk. I was trying, with my talk, basically, I want to convince you of two things: that there's this framework, stochastic hybrid systems, which is you can use it to model lots of systems. I suddenly started cyber-physical systems, and in the last few years, we've been having lots of fun applying it to biology. The analysis is difficult, but there's quite a few things that are working. You know, the time-triggered linear systems, just a few years ago, we sort of figured out necessary and sufficient conditions. The non-linear are very open, but of course you can't expect those to be closed questions because just non-linear ODEs are very difficult to solve. But there's probably lots of clever tricks to construct the Lyapunov functions and do all sorts of analysis that can be done there. That's in the theory of hybrid systems. And if you want to go to applications, you know, lots of things. We've studied a lot gene regulation. I can tell you in one of the latest projects I have, it's to try to understand, once you have these formulas, you can, for example, ask questions like this. Could one of these mechanisms, let's say feedback, by what process could feedback evolve through the process of natural selection? Right? Could it evolve? I mean, it exists, so apparently it did evolve. But what's the mechanism by which it evolved? And it's, in fact, that question is kind of interesting because, you see, suppose that you're trying to regulate a protein, and you have a primordial organism which has no feedback, right? And you'd like to regulate this, perhaps because you want to keep the protein level above a certain threshold beyond which you die. I mean, the cell dies. You have a mutation that introduces feedback, negative feedback. Well, that certainly reduces the variance of the variable, but also decreases the mean, because negative feedback is producing less protein. That's what negative feedback is. So suddenly you got closer to the threshold, but with a smaller variance. In some cases, that actually can increase fitness. In other cases, it doesn't. Right? So these formulas that I've shown you before, in fact, sort of tells us under what conditions. For example, they would say that feedback, now this is not obvious, and you sort of have to do, feedback is more likely to have evolved in mechanisms where this function G has particular shapes. This function turns out generally to be what's called a Hill function. Hill functions with high coefficients would be more likely to evolve out of a process of natural selection. Okay? So it's kind of interesting biological insights. So thank you very much.
So we'll take time for a few questions while Dr. Hespanha takes down and
Yes.
Dr. Weiss sets up, and then we'll begin with the next talk.
Daniel.
So one other thing, I guess, you could make random in your model is the discrete state to which you go after.
Yes, and that has been done. I didn't show it in the slide just not to get too confusion, but that definitely can be done, and it was done.
Joao,